Greetings. This is Mr. D, and I wanted to touch base with you at the beginning of this module and talk to you a little bit about demand. So here we go. In economics, when we talk about demand, really you got to keep in mind what markets actually are, like we discussed in the last module. That markets are agreements or arrangements between buyers and sellers. And in our market economy, all goods, the price of all goods is determined through an interaction between supply and demand. And so price system is actually another term for supply and demand. And so what we're going to talk about is the demand part right now. So the definition of demand is conditional. And you might have noticed in the book that there's really three main conditions. You have to be willing and able at this time period. And it's the amount that people will buy of a product or a resource that they're willing to buy, that they're able to buy at that time period. So we got tools that we use when studying demand, and they're going to be the same for supply. And the tool that we use to understand people's demand for a product is the demand schedule. And it shows the relationship between price, which is often written as a big P, and quantity demanded, which is QD. And basically a demand schedule is a table. It looks something similar to this. It'll be titled Demand Schedule, and this particular product is widgets, just a hypothetical product. So you've got a list of prices, and then you see the quantities that would be demanded at those prices. So at $1, $1,000, $1 million, people would demand 100 widgets. And at 2, they would only demand 80. So as the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. And so a demand curve is basically taking the information from the demand schedule and constructing a plotted graph. And it's going to visually show us the relationship between price and quantity demand. And so a demand curve, our second tool, looks like this. So when you look at a demand curve, there's some things that you'll notice. It is downward sloping. We have labeled price on the vertical. We've labeled quantity on the horizontal, and we have named the line. Most often you just name it D. Okay, so the law of demand is also a visual representation of a demand curve, and it is negatively sloped, which means it's sloping down. And so if you look at the market for tacos, you can see that at P0 or at P0, that's how many tacos people would demand. That's the quantity. And what would happen if the price went down? If you lowered the price of tacos, people would demand more tacos. Quantity demanded would go up. Price went down, quantity demanded went up. And so visually we can see all of this information on a demand curve. So writing the law of demand in simple terms, you can say that P goes up, quantity demand goes down. If price goes down, quantity demand goes up. And we say that that has an inverse relationship. Not an opposite relationship, but an inverse relationship. So another point that you might have checked in the reading is that the law of demand is the base of, is as a result of two human behaviors. And the human behaviors are pretty simple to easy to understand. It's the substitution effect, which basically says that anytime we perceive a price as too high or rising, we look for a substitute good. And then the income effect, which simply stated means that the more money that we make, the more our consumption goes up. So when you ask why it is negatively sloped or why is it downward sloping, the first two reasons are the ones that we just talked about. It's the income effect and the substitution effect. And then there's another reason, and it's the law of diminishing marginal utility. Law of diminishing marginal utility. Really a long name for something that's pretty easy to understand. Basically, it states that the more of something that you get, the more utility or satisfaction that you get from consuming it. You know, the diagram here shows shoes. This guy is very happy to get his first pair of shoes, but as he keeps getting shoes, it becomes more of a burden than as a benefit. Same thing with a Coke, a cold drink. For a dime, you might love to have a cold drink, but after about the third or fourth, it's just not as good as it was the first one. So your utility is diminishing. Sometimes that's called disutility. The Model T is a really good example of the law of demand. And basically, Henry Ford said that every time he lowers the price of his car, he sees a substantial increase in how many cars people can buy. So when we look at a demand curve, really all we're doing is comparing 2 points on a basic demand curve, and we are talking about changes in quantity demand. So if you go from point A to point B, what had to happen? We had to have a decrease in price, and we had to have an increase in how much people will buy. Vice versa, if we were going from B to A, it would be an increase in price and a decrease in the quantity demanded. Okay, so a change in QD is written as delta, that's for change, and just a real quick, cheat sheet types notes. When we talk about quantity demand, we are talking about movement along the demand curve, and that means there's been a change in price. Only one thing can cause how much of something that we buy, and that is a change in price, and that's movement along the demand curve. So we are strictly talking about quantity demanded right now, and you're going to see this graphic in a couple of the modules when we talk about law of demand. Okay, so now we're done talking about quantity demand or a change in quantity demand. Now we're talking about an actual change in demand, and that looks completely different. A change in demand must be caused by something called the determinants. So shifts in demand means we have lifted the rule that we had applied in the original demand curve, and we are now letting other factors come into play. So we have lifted ceteris paribus. And so once we lift ceteris paribus, that takes into account a lot of different behavior changes in people. So that causes demand curves to shift. So if anything besides price occurs, then the demand curve will shift. We have positive shifts in demand, which would be rightward. Try to avoid saying up or down. That is used for quantity demand. A rightward shift or a positive shift, and a leftward shift or a negative shift. And if you were to look at it on the demand curve, this would show a positive shift. The only thing that's missing on this particular model is you should put the D1 off on the right side. So this is a positive rightward shift. This is a negative or leftward shift. So what causes this? Well, many different things. Thousands of things would cause demand to have a positive shift or a negative shift. But as economists, we try to put them into categories. The first one is often referred to as tastes and preferences of buyers. The second one is population of buyer, or sometimes referred to as the number of customers. Third one is income of buyer, which is very similar to the income effect. 4 and 5 are substitutes and complements, which you're going to see in the modules. You need to make sure you know the difference of. So the first one, taste and preferences, can cause a positive shift or a negative shift. It is the most common change in demand is people's tastes and preferences change. What causes that? Mostly it's got something to do with advertising, but also deals with fads. It deals with anything seasonal, like anything that has to do with holidays or seasons. It deals with anything to do with fashion or your own body, health issues, health safety issues. Also celebrity, any kind of star power will also affect demand, and that falls under tastes and preferences. Okay, the second one is population of buyer. It's a very simple rule. If population increases, it's a positive shift. If population decreases, it's a negative shift. Pretty straightforward. Population explosions are positive. Immigration is very positive to the economy. Tourism is very positive to the economy. Of course, death would be bad for most products. So population is good for almost every product. Population goes up, people buy more consumer goods. Okay, income of buyer. Also very easy to understand. If your income goes up, it's a positive shift, and if your income goes down, it's a negative shift. But that's for 95% of all the products that are out there that we would call normal goods. That means a normal good is if your income went up, you would buy more of it. But an inferior good is a good that if your income went up, you would buy less of it. And it's pretty easy to picture goods that if like you hit the lottery or if you suddenly came into a bunch of money that you would never buy and you would never do. Often examples would be like riding on a Greyhound bus. Probably wouldn't do that. Or eating cheap ramen noodles. Or buying certain store brand items. Used to be staying at Holiday Inns, but those are kind of nice now. If you're buying toilet paper and you can see wood chips in it, that would be a good example of an inferior good. Or anything generic. Often like generic branded items are lower quality and people wouldn't buy those if they had the choice not to. Okay. So horrible, like beat up, junk cars would be a negative shift if income went up, but brand new cars would be a positive shift. Okay, substitutes. You need to get a handle on substitutes. Those are two goods that are very similar. So, if the price of a substitute goes up, it'll have an effect on another market. So what would happen if the price of coffee went up? Well, people would buy less coffee, and they would look for a substitute, and perhaps that substitute would be tea, and that would be a positive shift in tea. So Ford and Chevy would be considered substitutes. Fast food restaurants, beef, chicken, fish, pork, all would be substitutes. Complements are things that go together. And so if the price of DVDs goes up, people would buy less DVDs. That would also affect the market for DVD players. And so complementary goods are things that go together like PB and jelly, cereal and milk, and chips and salsa, hot dogs and relish and buns, and all kinds of nonsense. Cameras and film and okay, so substitutes. If you get a chance, check this out. What would happen if something simple like the price of cereal went down? That means people would buy more cereal. It would have a negative effect on the Pop-Tart market, but it would have a positive effect on the milk market. So the big thing about demand that you're going to need to understand is make sure that you understand the difference between quantity demanded and demand. They are completely different. They look completely different. And one is a price thing and one is not a price thing. And so visually you can see that a change in quantity demanded is movement along the line, and a change in demand is going to be a shift in the whole demand curve. Okay, well, I hope that helped you out. Good luck with this module. Of all of the topics in economics, supply and demand is sometimes the trickiest, but it is one of the most important things in economics to understand. So if you have any questions, get with me, and good luck to you.